Well, to discuss how to tackle far-right extremism, I'm joined by our Impact Minds panel, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who is a research fellow at the Centre on Radicalisation and Terrorism at the Henry Jackson Society, Julie Siddiqi, founder of Sadaqah Day, an event where Muslims and non-Muslims can volunteer and give back to the community, and Adam Hadley, director of Tech Against Terrorism. Thank you all for joining us here on the programme. Dr. Rakib Ehsan, I'll begin with you. I mean, we often talk about how Islamist extremists become radicalised, but we don't really know much about how someone becomes a far-right extremist. And can you help us understand that?
I think in terms of looking at the two forms of terrorism, when we're looking at far-right terrorism, it's important to understand that it's more of a journey of self-radicalisation. And that naturally poses problems from a monitoring perspective in terms of detecting people who might be involved in far-right terrorism activity. They're less likely to be affiliated with an established extremist organisation. They're more likely to be socially isolated. They don't tend to be socially embedded. So naturally you would see that it would be more difficult to monitor people and detect people who may be involved in far-right extremist activity. In 2016-17, Henry Jackson Society produced research which found that in Western countries there was a fourfold increase in far-right terrorist attacks. But the interesting statistic there is the people behind those attacks, only 4% of them were known to the authorities in those countries.
So when we say they're lone actors, they're not part of a bigger structure like Islamists can be?
Yeah, in comparison to Islamist-inspired terrorism, they're more likely to be socially isolated, which is interesting. There's an interesting paradox there where they're talking about, protecting their communities, but they're actually disconnected from those very communities they seek to preserve and protect.
Let's bring you into the conversation, Adam, because you do a lot of work with tech and terrorism. How widespread is this particular phenomenon?
What we find is that violent Islamist extremists and far-right violent extremists have a lot in common in terms of how they use the media and the internet, both to get their terrorist propaganda out there and recognised into the mainstream, and also in terms of radicalisation. So that there are some parallels in terms of how all of this is used. But I think it's important to focus on what terrorists want. What terrorists want, first and foremost, is political change, to force political change. And part of that means that they need recognition. They need publicity from traditional media, from the larger social media platforms. But that isn't the full story. Of course, terrorists of all sorts also use smaller internet platforms. And at Tech Against Terrorism, we work with the UN, with the larger platforms and the smaller ones, because it's important to understand that it's an ecosystem of sites and services that are being used. Many of them, the general public perhaps wouldn't have heard of, but they're kind of essential in terms of the dissemination of content for that particular group of terrorists.
So if we look at, say, 2007 is a stat that we had where there was only one incident reported. Why are we now seeing this particular rise, and is it growing out of the internet and from social media platforms?
I think it's important to focus on some of the causes of terrorism and violent extremism in society. In many cases, we're talking about real people in real communities with real grievances. And certainly the internet has been around for some time. Facebook is, 15 years old. So I think it would be hard to say that the internet is causing this, but of course we all use the internet for communication, to get information, and it increasingly mediates our experience of the world. So it's not surprising that the internet plays a role in radicalisation. Of course it does, but actually that perhaps is more a reflection of society, is more the effect, not necessarily the cause. To be clear though, we're not saying that the internet has got nothing to do with this, but rather it's part of the challenge.
A bigger challenge. Julie, I'll just bring you into this because when you heard a week ago about this particular incident, I mean, what went through your mind as a woman who's part of the Muslim community?
I mean, it was heartbreaking. Even thinking about it now, I feel emotional again. I think it was that kind of shock, I guess. A sense of, how could something like this happen? Imagine how it must have been for the families. I was thinking about my teenage children and what am I going to say to them when they wake up. How do we process something like this? A real sense of grief, actually. I think more than anything else. I think then for me, I still even will always remember it, how I felt this kind of sense of anger and frustration as well. That, yes, it's shocking, but is it surprising? I think there's a lot of us, not just Muslims, that were feeling that maybe something like this was bound to happen, whether it be here in Europe or we see in New Zealand.
Why did you feel that?
I think, look, we've been seeing a build-up.
A lot about the lack of surprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there's been a build-up of many things that I think are associated. I mean, we heard just now about the fact that we're talking about lone actors. I'm just not sure I fully agree with that, because I think, today I've just been reading the latest report from Hope Not Hate, where they're very, very cleverly link all of these people together. The fact that the person who carried out this terrorist attack referenced things that happened in the UK or talked about things in Europe. For me, they're linking all of these things together. And if you look at what's been happening even here in the last couple of years, Thomas Mayer, who killed Joe Cox, and the kind of things he was talking about, Darren Osborne, who literally got in a van, deliberately went from Wales to Finsbury Park Mosque and killed a man and injured others, and he specifically was referenced to have been radicalised online by things and videos that he's seen from people here. 5 out of 10 of the social media accounts around the world that have the most following, 5 out of 10 of them are British. So we feel from here that it's not overly surprising.
Dr. Rakib, do you agree with the point that Julie is making, that this kind of saying that they're lone actors is not something she agrees with, that this is part of a bigger sort of dynamic? But
then Julie also made the point how the individuals sought material online. I think that I was making a comparison with Islamist-inspired terrorism. Far-right terrorists, they tend to go on a path of self-radicalisation in comparison to Islamist-inspired terrorists. I'm actually making that point because that shows that there needs to be more time, energy, resources devoted towards developing more sophisticated monitoring mechanisms, including within communities, when it comes to defeating far-right terrorist activity, purely because they tend to be socially isolated. They're less likely to be attached to structured networks. Mm-hmm. So it's important to identify those problems and work with that.
How much, when you looked at the coverage that the media had of the incident in New Zealand, did you see distinctions between that and the way, say, an attack by an Islamist is covered?
I would say that regarding media coverage, I think was really good is seeing the media coverage on Jacinda Ardern's response to the devastating far-right terrorist attacks in Christchurch, a very affectionate response. I think that what was also really warming was looking at the response to Fraser Anning's comments, disgraceful comments in the aftermath of the attacks. The reality of the matter is, I think it's far more important to focus on Jacinda Ardern's actions, because she's ultimately...
Well, let's just have some clarity on Fraser Anning.
Okay, sure.
Just that he's an Australian senator, he put out a statement.
Shortly after the attacks, he blamed it on Muslim immigration into Australasia, in a sense justifying the actions of the far-right terrorists behind the Christchurch attacks, which was disgraceful, and I'm glad that it received the widespread condemnation that it did.
Do you think, though, there are people within communities who believe that, who say it's not just about immigration, but also the wave of attacks that Islamists have launched in Europe and in other parts of the world? In
a sense that Islamist-inspired terrorism and far-right terrorism, they're feeding off one another. I think that's true to an extent, but also make the point that the perpetrator behind the Christchurch terrorist attacks, in this quasi-manifesto that he produced, he also talked about ethnic, racial and cultural displacement. So I think talking about those demographic shifts, which might not be related to Muslim communities, that shows that far-right terrorist ideology is far broader than that, and the idea that if we were to clamp down and address defeat Islamist-inspired terrorism, that would automatically solve far-right terrorism, I think that's simplistic.
And that's the part of our bigger question here. How do you deal with far-right extremism? Because we've talked often about the de-radicalisation of Islamists, but how do you deal with a lone actor, for example?
with careful consideration. In terms of how the internet is used by terrorists, something that we're calling for is better distinction in the debate. Often politicians and policymakers are quite vague in exactly what they mean by far-right extremism, and where content's concerned, the challenge for internet platforms of all sizes is coming up with a definition that doesn't impact freedom of expression. And the interesting thing about freedom of expression is that's one of the main narratives of the far right. The far right is preoccupied by the idea of not being allowed to say its mind.
And the internet was used to live stream part of this incident that took place in New Zealand. Do you think that platforms like Facebook act quickly enough?
Well, my understanding from that is around 200 people viewed the live stream while it was while it was in kind of process, and was shortly after taken down. And 24 hours after that, Facebook stopped 1.5 million attempts to have that uploaded. I think a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
But it was widely shared.
Yeah. But the problem is with the internet is once information is there, it's very hard to kind of stop that onward dissemination. I think an interesting point there is that when it was picked up by mainstream media, it then also spread across the internet like wildfire.
Julie, I mean, do you want to come in? Do you think that social media platforms do act quickly enough when something like this happens?
No, I mean, just picking up on the point at the end there about mainstream media, you know, for me it's an absolute disgrace that there are UK based media companies that actually, you know, gave an option for people to download this manifesto from their websites and also, you know, had some of these videos available. I mean, why would they do that? And so for me that's a massive question that they need to answer. I personally think that
Adam was making was that a platform like Facebook acted swiftly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, over the years, the social media platforms have hidden behind this idea of free speech. And while we all value that aspect of free speech, we also can't just have a blanket version of that. I think in this case, as Adam has said, and he's more knowledgeable about the tech than I am, that Facebook acted quicker. But I think, you know, the fact that people were still able to view these things online, the fact that they can take down certain, even individual comments when they want to, but something as big as that and as damaging as that, I think is...
Just briefly, is that something you agree with?
Well, I think we've got to remember the internet is not just Facebook, it's not just Google, and sure, they're big sites and we're all familiar with them, but in reality, it's, in violent Islamist extremism and far-right extremism, there are dozens of other forums and sites and that's actually where the majority of the activity is. So certainly the challenge with this particular case is once the video was made, it only took 1 or 2 people to then reshare that for it to go everywhere across the internet. And in terms of how Facebook dealt with it, it's hard to see how they could have done it much faster.
Dr. Rakib, I mean, just a final thought really on how to deal with far-right extremism. How do you tackle it? How do you de-radicalise?
I think for me what's really important is there's greater cross-group cooperation when it comes to defeating all forms of terrorism and extremism in our communities. And I think there's definitely scope for that.
But how do you do that? I mean, you know, you talk about structures within, say, the Muslim community that looks at de-radicalisation. But if you're talking about lone actors, how do you actually?
I think we need a more inclusive, multi-agency approach to this. Whether it's community groups, local neighbourhood policing teams, social services, they need to all cooperate.
But a lot of these
together.
people have gone under the radar. That's part of the problem.
Well, that's precisely why, because of the complexity surrounding far-right terrorist activity, this is really the time for different actors within society to be communicating together, to be cooperating more in order to defeat far-right terrorist activity in our communities.
Rakib, Adam and Julie, thank you all for joining us.